Flowering plants are the dominant photosynthetic organisms in almost every ecosystem. A plant never becomes an adult the way an animal does. Plants keep growing. Trees attain great ages along with producing generation after generation genetically identical plants. Have you ever wondered how this complicated process of reproduction takes place in plants? How male genetic material is carried to female gamete in plants? If you remember the functional aspect of different parts of a plant, you can easily answer this question. In our discussion today, we will discuss about the development of male gametophyte of flowering plants.
Hello students, I hope all of you know about the structure of a typical bisexual flower. A flower has 4 whorls of floral leaves, sepals, petals, stamens and carpels. These last 2 parts, that is stamens and carpels, represent male and female reproductive structures of flowers respectively. Stamens consist of a stalk or a filament and usually a bilobed anther where each lobe has 2 chambers called pollen sacs. Pollen grains are produced in pollen sacs. A carpel consists of 3 parts, namely stigma, style and ovary. Today we will discuss about the development of male gametophyte, which is present in powder-like material present on anthers. Students, ਤੁਸੀਂ ਖੁੱਲੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਫੁੱਲਾਂ ਦੇ ਉੱਪਰ ਪੀਲੀ ਅਤੇ ਭੂਰੇ ਜਿਹੇ ਧੂੜ ਵਰਗੇ ਕੰਨ ਦੇਖੇ ਹੋਣਗੇ। ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਕਈਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਇਸ ਧੂੜ ਵਰਗੇ ਪਦਾਰਥ ਬਾਰੇ ਅੰਦਾਜ਼ਾ ਵੀ ਹੋਵੇਗਾ। ਕਈ ਵਾਰ ਇਹ ਧੂੜ ਸਾਡੇ ਸਰੀਰ ਤੇ ਐਲਰਜੀ ਪੈਦਾ ਕਰ ਦਿੰਦੀ ਹੈ ਅਤੇ ਸਾਡੀਆਂ ਅੱਖਾਂ 'ਚੋਂ ਪਾਣੀ ਦਾ ਵਹਿਣਾ ਅਤੇ ਛਿੱਕਾਂ ਦਾ ਆਉਣ ਦਾ ਕਾਰਨ ਬਣਦੀ ਹੈ। Of all the things that can cause an allergy, pollen is one of the most common allergen and it is really difficult to avoid. We will discuss more about allergy caused by pollens later. But first, let's talk about development of male gametophyte. I was talking about dust-like particles present in an opened flower. You know, under microscope, these dust particles show distinctive, beautiful ornamentations on their wall. They can survive in extreme heat and cold, can remain intact for thousands or millions of years. Students, ਕੀ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਸਾਈਜ਼ ਬਾਰੇ ਕੋਈ ਅੰਦਾਜ਼ਾ ਹੈ? ਇਹ ਇੰਨੇ ਛੋਟੇ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਹਨ ਕਿ ਅਸੀਂ ਇਸ ਨੂੰ ਨੰਗੀ ਅੱਖ ਨਾਲ ਤਾਂ ਬਿਲਕੁਲ ਵੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਦੇਖ ਸਕਦੇ। ਇਹ ਮਾਇਓਸੋਟਿਸ ਪੌਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ 2 ਮਾਈਕਰੋਮੀਟਰ ਅਤੇ ਮਿਰਾਬੈਲਿਸ ਵਿੱਚ 250 ਮਾਈਕਰੋਮੀਟਰ ਆਕਾਰ ਦੇ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਹਨ। A flower produces 2 types of cells, or we may call spore, microspore and megaspore. A microspore develops into a microgametophyte and megaspore develops into megagametophyte. Microgametophyte produces male gametes and megagametophyte produces female gametes. The microgametophyte is a mature pollen grain which is either windblown or carried by an animal to the vicinity of its female counterpart, that is megagametophyte. So pollens are small wonders or vehicles in which male genetic material is carried to female gamete. Pollen protects the male nucleus until fertilization takes place. These minute grains are usually yellow in color but also in white, brown or red and purple in color. They are born in the anther sac present at the tip of slender filament of the stamen of flowering plant. Pollen grains develop in anther of a flower, travel long distances and get deposited on the receptive stigma of the flower. By receptive stigma, we mean female part of a mature flower ready for reproduction. How is it possible that a small grain like this is capable of making a new plant? How it can survive under adverse climatic conditions and still remain viable? I will discuss all this in detail, but first let me share the learning objectives of today's lesson.
On completion of this topic, learners will be able to define microspore and megaspore, explain importance of male gametophyte in flowering plants, describe stages of development of pollen grains, describe the structure of pollen grain, discuss various aspects related to pollen grains like pollen viability, pollen allergy, and pollen products.
Dust-like powder present on anther, in fact, is made up of pollen. Pollen is a fine coarse powder consisting of a pollen grains. Although these pollens are very soft to touch, but each pollen grain consists of a hard coat which protects the sperm cell during the process of their movement during pollination. Pollen grains like sperms are always produced in much greater quantities than are actually used. Let's see how these pollen grains develops.
Development of pollen grain, Microsporogenesis. Each anther lobe contains two long and cylindrical pollen sacs or microsporangia. A dithecous anther is tetrasporangiate. When two pollen sacs of each anther lobe fuse to form single chamber or thecus at maturity, such an anther is called dithecous. Tetrasporangiate means four sporangia. If we look at the structure of a microsporangium, it is covered by different walls. Outermost wall is made up of epidermal cell, so known as epidermis. Rest of the layers from outside to center comprise endothecium, middle layers and tapetum. The outer layer perform the function of protection and help in dehiscence of anther to release the pollens. The innermost layer, tapetum, nourishes the developing pollen grains, which are developed from pollen mother cells. These pollen mother cells are compactly arranged and form sporogenous tissue. So here we can say that the center of each microsporangium is occupied by this sporogenous tissue. Now each pollen mother cell undergoes meiotic division to form microspore tetrad. At this stage, each cell is known as microsporocyte or microspore mother cell, and the process of formation of microspores from a pollen mother cell through meiosis is known as microsporogenesis. So this is how microspore tetrad formation takes place. As the anthers mature and dehydrate, the microspores dissociate from each other and develop into pollen grains.
So students, here we saw that inside each microsporangium several thousands of microspores or pollen grains are formed that are released with the dehiscence of one anther. Dehiscence here means anther bursts to release pollen grains. So here you saw how a cluster of 4 cells is formed. Students, as I have already told you that the process of formation of microspores from a pollen mother cell through meiosis is known as microsporogenesis. On maturity of anthers, each microspore present in this tetrad dissociates and develops into pollen grains. Each pollen grain represents the male gametophyte. Have you ever touched an opened flower? If so, you might have found that the deposition of powdery substance on your fingers. Under a microscope, if you observe this powdery substance, you will be surprised to see its shape and structure. Let's see a video in which structure of a pollen grain will be clear to you.
Structure of a pollen grain. This is a pollen grain. It has a 2-layered wall. The outer wall is known as exine and the inner wall is known as intine. Exine is made up of highly resistant substance known as sporopollenin. It can withstand high temperature and even strong alkali and acids. At certain places, the exine is thin or absent. In this area, only intine is present, which is thickened due to deposition of cellulose and pectin. Such areas are known as germ pores. Cytoplasm, present in pollen grain, is rich in starch and saturated oils, which protects it from radiation damage. Its outer wall has various ornamentations on it, which helps to identify the type of pollen grain and refer them to their family genus or species. In a young pollen grain, there is a centrally placed nucleus embedded in dense cytoplasm. With time, it grows and vacuoles develop. The protoplast then divides mitotically to form two unequal cells. Large cell with lots of cytoplasm called tube cell or vegetative cell. Smaller cell with lesser cytoplasm called generative cell. Nuclei of two cells are almost of same size. This is all about the structure of a mature pollen grain.
The structures of the pollen grains of different plant species vary mostly in the nature of their walls, called sporoderm. Study of external morphology of pollen grains is called palynology. ਬੱਚੋ ਕਿੰਨੀ ਅਜੀਬ ਗੱਲ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਪੋਲਨ ਗ੍ਰੇਨਸ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਨੰਗੀ ਅੱਖ ਨਾਲ ਨਜ਼ਰ ਤੱਕ ਨਹੀਂ ਆਉਂਦੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਅੰਦਰ ਇੰਨਾ ਕੁਝ ਲੁਕਿਆ ਹੋਇਆ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਵਿਸ਼ਵਾਸ ਕਰਨਾ ਮੁਸ਼ਕਿਲ ਲੱਗਦਾ ਹੈ. If we talk about the period for which a pollen grain may be viable, it varies from 20 minutes to years, depending upon environmental conditions of temperature and humidity. There is a term used for this period, that is pollen viability. It is the period for which a pollen grain remains active to germinate. It is also possible to store pollen grains for years. How? Basically, they are stored in liquid nitrogen at minus 196 degrees Celsius. It is used to preserve pollen grains to use them later in plant breeding program. ਬੱਚੋ ਮੇਰੇ ਖਿਆਲ ਵਿੱਚ ਨਰ ਯੁਗਮਕ ਪਰਾਗ ਕਣ ਭਾਵ pollen grain ਦੀ ਬਣਤਰ ਹੁਣ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਚੰਗੀ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਸਮਝ ਆ ਗਈ ਹੋਵੇਗੀ. Let us now understand how male gametophyte develops further or gets mature. As I told you earlier, in all seed plants, male and female gametophytes develop within the parent plant body. Such development of male gametophyte is called precocious development. Pollen grains are immature male gametophyte which remain surrounded by a thick protective wall. During pollination, the pollen grain is shed from the anther and carried by wind, insects or any other agents to the female gametophyte. On reaching a suitable stigma, a pollen grain starts getting mature. After absorbing moisture from stigma, intine starts coming out of germ pore in form of pollen tube and male gametes pass into the pollen tube. Some other changes also take place and collectively all these changes known as post-pollination development. Let's see how a pollen behaves once it lands on suitable stigma.
Pollen stigma interaction. This is a bisexual flower. During pollination, many pollen grains land on stigma. Some of them get a chance to get accepted by stigma, but like sperm, only a lucky one gets the entry. Surface properties of the pollen grain decide whether the right pollen germinates on a right stigma or not. Pollen that is distributed by the wind has to travel large distances. This pollen grain, on landing on a stigma, absorbs water and nutrients through germ pores. This is how the original pollen grain looks like. Let's see now what is happening inside the pollen during pollen-pistil interaction. Usually, outer covering, that is exine of a pollen, is perforated by several apertures. These are the sites chosen by the growing pollen tube. The tube cell enlarges, comes out of the pollen grain through germ pores or furrow. This structure, so formed, is known as pollen tube. The generative cell also passes into it. It soon divides into two non-motile male gametes. This part in the visual is style. At this stage, pollen tube containing 3 nuclei travels through the style by hydrolyzing it and getting nourishment from its cells. Sometimes, generative cells do not divide, and pollen grain with pollen tube carry 2 nuclei, that is, tube nucleus and generative nucleus. This pollen grain, with pollen tube carrying male gametes, represents a mature male gametophyte.
Usually during almost all seasons, pollens are released from trees, weeds and grasses. Although their mission is to fertilize female reproductive part, that is carpel of same or other plants. But many never reach their targets. A large amount of pollen is released in air, especially during flowering season. A few will land on a receptive stigma or female organ. It may land in your eyes or you could breathe it in. Some symptoms of pollen allergies are stuffy nose, itchy eyes, headaches, sore throat and troubled breathing. How much pollen that is in the air depends on the time of the day and if the weather is windy and warm. The total amount of pollen in the air for a day is called the pollen count. How do pollens cause allergy? As I discussed earlier, pollen grains carry on their exterior a tough coat of proteins. The female parts of the flower needs these proteins to distinguish the correct match for pollination. If you inhale in pollen grains or they get into your eyes, these proteins are discharged just as if they landed on a receptive female stigma. Normally, the immune system take care of the foreign proteins by discarding them. Some people have an immune system that could not discard pollen proteins. Instead, a process takes place that releases a chemical called histamine. The histamine causes the symptoms of allergy. If you are allergic to pollen, then you probably pay attention to avoid such areas where there is too much of flowering. It's almost impossible to avoid pollen unless you stay indoors and you have an extensive air filter system in your home, which is near impossible in our Indian living conditions. There are a few ways you can lower your exposure to pollens. Take a bath or shower and change your clothes after you have been outside. It is best to stay indoors during the morning hours. Also, try to avoid being outdoors on dry days or when the wind is strong. But why do we get allergy? Allergy is a result of an overreaction of a person's immune system. People with allergies have a hyper alert immune system that overreacts to substances. The immune system of allergic people overreact to pollen. Is everyone allergic to pollens? No. People inherit a tendency to be allergic from their parents. If one parent is allergic, then a child has a 50% chance of inheriting this allergic tendency. If both parents are allergic, then there is a 75% chance of a child being allergic as well. So it all depends upon heredity factor. Pollen products as a diet supplement. Students, do you know that in spite of being so allergic, they are being used in a variety of kitchen products? Pollen grains, especially those which are collected by bees, are used in nature care, cosmetics and as food supplements. Pollen products have many uses and are extremely beneficial in prevention of many diseases and disorders. Bee pollen is rich in vitamins, has 22 amino acids, 27 minerals including calcium, magnesium, zinc, copper, iron, etc., and trace elements and over 5,000 enzymes and coenzymes. These days, pollens are provided in the form of capsules and tablets, which are recommended to be taken daily. The ancient Greek Olympians used pollens in improving their performance in the field. It is considered one of the nature's most completely nourishing foods. It contains nearly all nutrients required by humans. About half of its protein is in the form of free amino acids that are ready to be used directly by the body. Such highly assimilable protein can contribute significantly to one's protein needs. Pollen grain, its structure and development. In our today's class, we learned in detail about pollen grain, which is the first cell of male gametophyte. One quality which I discussed with you is that they can survive in extreme heat and cold, can remain live for thousands or millions of years. Students, first of all, we discussed about the development of male gametophyte, which is precocious, that is, it begins inside the microsporangium or pollen sac. I hope you remember what is pollen. Here you can see it once again. How do they get developed? Just see this movie once again. Sporogenous cells fill the whole of pollen sac. With number of divisions, they get transformed into microspore mother cell. Here you can see each separated mother cell undergoing meiosis, resulting into tetrad of haploid microspores. Each of this haploid microspore turns out to be a pollen grain. What was the term I told you about the whole process? Yes, this whole process is known as microsporogenesis. Let's see a video in which structure of a pollen grain will be clear to you. This is a cut section of a pollen grain which has a two-layered covering. The outer wall may have pores and furrows. This layer is made up of proteins and is known as exine. This layer is highly resistant to adverse conditions. The inner layer is known as intine. The area where exine is thin or absent is known as germ pore. In this immature young pollen grain, there is a centrally placed nucleus. As time passes, protoplasm divides mitotically to form two unequal cells. One of them is known as tube cell and the other one is known as generative cell. This was part of pre-pollination development. Now let's see what happens once this pollen grain falls on stigma, means once pollination has taken place. Watch it again. Post-pollination development. The tube cell enlarges, comes out the pollen grain through one of the germ pores. This tube is covered by intine. The tube nucleus reaches to the tip of the pollen tube. Generative cell also passes into it. Goes on and on the way it divides into two cells known as male gametes. So this was all about post-pollination changes. Such pollen grain with pollen tube carrying male gametes represents mature male gametophyte. Let's revise about pollen allergy. The best way to avoid allergic reaction from pollens is to learn as much as you can about the plants that cause allergic reaction to you. This will help you to recognize the plants so that you can stay away from them when they are pollinating. Pollen grains of grass family plants cause 95% of all allergies. Pollen is good for health. Pollen is the finest, most perfect food and a giant germ killer. The health restoring properties of honeybee pollen have been proven time and time again. Bee pollen contains all the essential components of life. It has proved such a great energy provider that even players at times use pollen to improve their performance in the field. Do you know that to collect 1 tablespoon of pollen dust, a bee has to work 8 hours a day, continuously for 1 month? There is another term which we discussed in this lesson, pollen viability. It is the period for which pollen grains retain the ability to germinate. So this was all that I had to tell about the structure of pollen grain and development of male gametophyte. ਤਾਂ ਫਿਰ ਬੱਚਿਓ ਹੁਣ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਪਤਾ ਲੱਗ ਗਿਆ ਹੋਵੇਗਾ ਕਿ ਨਰ ਯੁਗਮਕ ਪਰਾਗਕਣ ਭਾਵ ਪੋਲਨ ਗ੍ਰੇਨ ਅਲੱਗ-ਅਲੱਗ ਕਿਰਿਆਵਾਂ ਤੋਂ ਗੁਜ਼ਰਦੇ ਹੋਏ ਉਥੋਂ ਜਾਂ ਕਿਸੇ ਹੋਰ ਫੁੱਲ ਦੀ ਪਰਾਗਕਣ ਗ੍ਰਾਹੀ ਜਾਂ ਸਟਿਗਮਾ ਤੱਕ ਪਹੁੰਚਦਾ ਹੈ ਅਤੇ ਉਸ ਦਾ ਮਾਦਾ ਯੁਗਮਕ ਨਾਲ ਮੇਲ ਹੋ ਜਾਂਦਾ ਹੈ। ਕਿੰਨਾ ਲੰਬਾ ਰਸਤਾ ਤੇ ਕਿੰਨੀ ਕਿਰਿਆਵਾਂ ਤੋਂ ਗੁਜ਼ਰ ਕੇ ਇਹ ਛੋਟਾ ਜਿਹਾ ਧੂਲ ਵਰਗਾ ਇੱਕ ਕਣ ਨਵੀਂ ਜ਼ਿੰਦਗੀ ਬਣਾ ਸਕਦਾ ਹੈ। I think now you have enough information on pollen grains and its change into male gametophyte. Now let me ask you some questions. I expect that you would be able to answer these questions. My first question is, name the plant producing smallest pollen grain. Its answer is Myosotis and its size is 2 micrometer. Next question, can you name the plant producing largest pollens? Answer is Mirabilis and its size goes up to 250 micrometer. Next question, name the cells which are present in a mature pollen grain. And the answer is a mature pollen grain contains 2 cells, large tube cell and small generative cell. My next question, name the wall or covering of pollen grain. And the answer is it is called sporoderm. My next question, wall of a pollen grain which is known as sporoderm divided into 2 layers. Name these layers. Answer is wall of a pollen grain which is known as sporoderm is formed of 2 layers. First is outer exine and second is inner intine. Next question, what forms pores or furrows for coming out of pollen tube? Answer is exine, which is discontinuous at places forms pores or furrows for pollen tube. These places are also known as germ pores. Next question, define palynology. Answer is study of external morphology of pollen grains is called palynology. My next question is, apart from genetic factor, what are the other factors on which viability of pollen grains depends? Answer is it depends upon environmental conditions like temperature and pressure. My next question is, tell at the time of pollination whether pollen grain is uninucleate, binucleate or multinucleate. And the answer is a mature pollen grain during pollination is binucleate having 1 tube nucleus and the other generative nucleus, or having 3 nuclei, 1 tube nucleus and 2 male gametes formed by division of generative nucleus. My next question is, name the stages of male gametophyte development. Answer is development of male gametophyte, which is also known as microgametogenesis, divided into 2 phases, pre-pollination development and post-pollination development. I am confident that all your doubts about structure of pollen grain and development of male gametophyte are clear today. I hope you enjoyed the lesson as much as I did and are looking forward for the next class. Thank you for your attention and see you next time.